We have two excellent speakers who are going to raise questions, do some summarizing perhaps. Our first speaker will be Ulinka Rublack. Ulinka is a professor of history from the University of Cambridge. She works on early modern European history. She's a fellow of St. John's College there. She's the author of the prize-winning study of the role of Renaissance dress to create and stimulate a cultural debate, and the title of that book is Dressing Up: Cultural Identity in Renaissance Europe. She also is the co-editor of a fascinating work, 16th century accountant who kept a record of all of his new outfits over his lifetime. It is quite remarkable, and her book about it is also quite remarkable. She's written on gender, on the Protestant Reformations, plural, and also has written on Hans Holbein's Dance of Death, among many, many other issues. So please welcome Ulinka Rublack.
Thank you very much, Pamela. I think we've all witnessed an event of real historical magnitude, and it's very characteristic of Pamela's work how she changes our practices, how she got the hand looms into the teaching room, how she fosters new collaborations that will change the face of scholarly work in the university. And I wondered whether you would like to join me just to take a moment now to thank Pamela for bringing us together. I think the significance of challenging then these old hierarchies between the world of craft as low and the world of the mind as separate and higher is very necessary, and we've all seen how relevant that is in different fields of academic world, the academic world as well as society more generally, how relevant it is to education, how relevant it is to neuroscience, where we're apparently still having to ask how different parts of the brain interconnect, and the how to and the what to side interconnect. And Dorothy Coe brought in the powerful perspectives of inactivism that have been developed in archaeology and anthropology that asks us to also consider the brain then as interconnected itself to the world of things and the world of people. So all the time, as you can see, and we've witnessed this since yesterday, really the scholarly vistas are huge. We're really thinking through paradigm shift after paradigm shift, which is why we've been so inspired. Listening to Usrama's talk today and then transferring that to my own field of history, her talking about the blind spots of history made me feel that, of course, the same goes on in European history. So my colleague in the UK, John Stiles, has been funded for the past 5 years, luckily, by the European Research Council to undertake the very first study of the spinning age before the machine in England, which of course employed vast numbers of women, and to reveal that as a sophisticated technology. I myself, at the moment, I'm doing the first sustained analysis of an extraordinary manual of dyeing techniques put together in 1548 by a worker in the Venetian shipbuilding complex. Nobody's looked at this. Why? So, we're really at the cutting edge of all this. We've learned that's the key perspective for the history of science and technology, that we need to rethink the loom. We need to rethink the loom then as this super sophisticated technology. And in fact, it's emerged that it's more sophisticated than the jacquard loom, the hand loom. And why is it more sophisticated? Because, as Carol Cassidy showed so prominently, it allows actually for more innovation, the innovation of individual weavers who can go along and change patterns rather than being confined to a pattern. And what Usrama's talk and Annapurna's talks brought out again today is that we, of course, we don't have to only think about the loom in itself, we have to think about the whole process of making that starts with growing the cotton and spinning the yarn, and they're thinking about the enabling of all the multiplicity and a huge complexity of ecologies, but also of types of yarn, and how modernity means limiting all this. So I want to starting from these points, I want to make 3 or 4 further points, starting from that overview of why we've encountered this as a superior technology. The first point is to then think about the intricacies of cognition and some of the puzzles we've encountered. So going back to the talk by Roger Kneebone and Izzy in that conversation, where it became so clear that we have to think through the importance of the tacit knowledge and the non-textual dimensions of knowledge making and how we can access them. And I thought it was very interesting how film was being used to make us aware that sometimes it's actually better you have to feel through something, and it really cannot be communicated. And why is that? And even more intriguingly for me were Izzy's comments then on how thinking about what you're doing, I think you were saying, is actually counterproductive. So how is it then that analytical thinking can be counterproductive rather than enabling? Yeah, and we learned also then about the dimension of music making, and the question that was brought to the fore in Annapurna's talk also about the interesting relationship between knowing rules and being free of them. And thinking through that dialectic seems of key importance. So is it, we were invited to think by the neuroscientist, the case that some brains are better than one thing at improvising and others are better at rule-bound behavior, or is there actually much more complex relationship between following rules and being able to be free of them? And then what are the social and political frameworks that enable that process to take shape, and what are the educational contexts that enable that to take shape? So the second point I want to make, this was on improvisation and cognition. Second point I want to make of what particularly struck me as a puzzle is the notion of expertise. So particularly in the talks yesterday, that was a recurring theme of, well, who's an expert? And I was particularly struck when Carol Cassidy spoke in relation to her tremendous experience. Is she still here, or did she have to leave? Extraordinary.
She's having to take down the loom, but she'll be back.
She has to, yeah, I mean, extraordinary experience as a weaver and then working with weavers. And she said, I don't feel like an expert. And why is that? Because she wants to challenge herself all the time. And so she herself stays open also to acknowledging the limits of her competence. And that resonated for me with Annapurna's talk yet again, in which she talked about the notion of humility and really unfolded the philosophy of what it means not to egotistically also assume the position of an expert. And on the other hand, it resonated with the work Pamela does, and the whole ethos which comes to the fore very strongly in the Renaissance, which is all about a celebration of trying things out. That is, I think you've put it almost like that, the mantra of the recipe books. The manuscript Pamela is studying for years now is, try it out, try that recipe out, experiment about. And that also, I think, is conducive not to just try to get really good at one particular thing and then perfect that, but once more in embracing almost the many possibilities and challenging yourself. And yet, on the other hand, perhaps we haven't talked enough about then the systems of accreditation of what makes you an expert that exists in all these societies and also in Carol's world. So, she clearly talked about some of her weavers as, extraordinarily skilled. So then what is it that seems to validate that? We also have master weavers. We have the guru even, this notion that, you said, Annapurna, you need a guru. And I think there's that discussion is, hasn't come together yet. Yeah. So that's a point about expertise. And I wanted to make a final point that came out of the talks yesterday, and we lost that a bit today, and that is about the social institutions that will have in the past and in the future will foster communication about sophisticated technologies. And in some of the talks yesterday, it was very strongly portrayed as being the case that the family is the one social institution where learning is done in the best way. And it was opposed to learning in the school. And it was also very strongly connected to the bond between a mother and a daughter, or a grandmother and a granddaughter. And I would like to open that up very much for discussion, because I think there are many problems with that narrative. There's the obvious gender problem as to who that excludes, so people who don't have families, people who don't have daughters, and so on and so forth. But also, I think it excludes a lot of what we learn through European history, where in many countries, such as Germany, there's a strong tradition in France of the arts et métiers, of very good systems of apprenticeship and learning, and with that comes a lot of prestige. The problem has been that that prestige has gone very often to men, and that historically there's been various processes of how women were then excluded from these institutions. But I want us to think about then the politics of supporting institutions rather than reverting to a narrative that says the family learning is superior. And that brings me to my final remark, that is about the future and the past in relation to it. So I think we have a lot of reason for optimism. We can think back to history and great models there. For instance, Pamela referenced the great interest of institutions like the Royal Society to talk to people in the crafts, and we could think of similar models and replicating those. Optimism also because of what you said earlier. We are now in a phase where so many people are fed up with the tragedy of narratives that are deadlocked, and the visions are deadlocked about more and more consumerism and productivity. There's such a broad maker movement. When you look on YouTube, it seems to me always that skills-based videos get huge numbers of hits. People want to know about making, and I think that must be partly to do with the fact that it appeals so much to the brain. And that interlinks, I think, with Daphne's talk, because the positive message there, and we've heard that today, is that message about the flexibility of the brain. She said it's a learning machine. So we as human beings, it seems to me, are calibrated for learning, and that means we are calibrated for learning about making. And it's just that a lot of that has been deadened, and it seems to me that we're reviving that. How do we bring together the talks before lunch today and the talks after lunch today? It seems to me that it would be fatal to try to bring them together by saying, well, there was the slow technology and then we talked about the high tech. We've been challenging that all the time, but maybe it's most productive to think about it as the multiple modernities we're going to see and that are open for experimentation. So, in the context of India, we see how going back to the hand loom opens a whole array of innovation and possibility, and is not about going back to tradition, as it were. Whereas in other contexts, we have different modernities where smart ecologies, ecologically sound technologies may be what is required. And that's my very final point, has then led us to think, of course, about not just cognition as such and making, but as the whole area of the history of emotions and how they connect. And that is very much, I think, the work of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ulinka. Next is Stephen Flusberg. Stephen is an assistant professor of psychology from SUNY Purchase College. He directs I love the name of his lab, the Everyday Cognition Lab. I want to know everything that goes on in it. And in that lab, they research the relationships between embodiment, language, and cognition by looking at quotidian practices like eating breakfast, lying on the couch, all kinds of things like that. And he's especially interested in the role that metaphor and analogy play in our ability to reason about complex and abstract domains. And often those metaphors and analogies are very much rooted in the material world. So please help me welcome Stephen Flusberg.
Thank you very much, Pamela. It's a very humbling experience to be here with so many very accomplished and inspiring scholars and activists and artists and craftspeople. I have learned a lot in the last 2 days, and I've probably learned a lot more about psychology than I would attending a psychology conference. And maybe that's one of the things we can talk about. One of the discussion points I'd like to raise is why have most of us, all of us, found this kind of interdisciplinary meeting so useful, so interesting, so inspiring, and why is that? What does that tell us about how we think and how we learn? And I gotta say, I feel very disembodied and constrained by having to lean into this mic. If you ever see me give a real lecture, I'm like wandering around. So if I'm not as projective or emotive as you might have thought by just speaking to me, it's because of this traditional lectern that I'm at. But I get that we're recording. So one thing that I wanted to do was, and again, Pamela mentioned I'm into metaphor, so I'm going to use it rather explicitly now, is I wanted to trace some of the threads that I saw running through these 2 days. And hopefully, if I can trace a couple threads, we can start to weave them together to facilitate discussion. Now, my ability to weave ended at friendship bracelets in camp. But hopefully, with everyone else's expertise, we can get to more of like a complex tapestry. So one of the most common threads that I think has been that emerged in almost every presentation, discussion, activity that I've seen is this tension between certain dualities or binaries. So this was explicitly discussed by Dorothy earlier today. And Pamela actually introduced it in her opening remarks yesterday, where the first thing she said was, we have this duality, this binary between mind and body. And she went on to say there's this tension, but we all know that that tension somehow should be dissolved or resolved, except it's difficult to think about how to do it. And I think what I'm going to try to do is trace some of the dualities that have emerged, and we'll see they kind of cluster together. And I'm hoping that that reveals something about how we think. Because one of the things that I would also like to discuss is something that hasn't been explicitly remarked on enough yet, in my opinion, but I'm biased because I'm a cognitive scientist, which is, what do we mean by cognition anyway? What is cognition? And I will describe some of the work that I do in my lab to try to address that. But the answer is, it's not what you think it is, maybe. So we have mind and body. This is the primary duality that was raised at the beginning of this session. And of course, we also have some of the duality between the explicit and the implicit, or the kind of verbalizable and the tacit. And so this has been seen in discussions, as Ulinka mentioned, Roger and Izzy's discussion brought up that there are aspects of craft, and Carol also discussed this yesterday, that are about doing, and it's this tacit knowledge. It's not explicit, it's not verbalizable. It's something you have to observe and that you have to do over and over again yourself to be able to master. So there's the mind and body, there's the explicit and the implicit. Related to that is sort of the innovation and creativity and improvisation on the one hand, compared to the more rote memorization on the other hand. And related to that was Daphne's distinction that, look, these dualities maybe even exist in our biology, that even within our brain, which is part of our body, I should say. It's not separate. It's part of our body. Even within our brain, we have different learning systems. One that deals more with habits, with rote memorization, with skill development that's tacit, and the other that deals with this more explicit, conscious awareness of our memories and our life events, and maybe gives us the flexibility and the innovation side. We've also seen in some of the discussions of the sort of political and social implications of weaving as the theme, but in general of the craft work, the distinction between traditionalism and modernism. I think Ulinka already started to dissolve this particular duality, or raise the possibility that that's something we might want to do, maybe, but that's certainly there. And along with that, there's sort of the high arts and fashion versus the more, I don't want to use the term low arts because of the negative connotation here, but the traditional craft work. And this also related in the discussion earlier today between the West on the one hand and the non-West on the other. I think we also see this, what played out there when we're discussing the sociopolitical implications is maybe capitalism and market forces on the one hand versus sort of subsistence and sustainability on the other hand. And again, we've seen our speakers want to dissolve these tensions, want to say that these dualities are not necessarily permanent and not necessarily always there, but certainly they're there in our minds right now as we navigate this difficult terrain. And of course, you also have something that's come up, I think, has been maybe a tension between academics on the one hand versus sort of practitioners or non-academics on the other. And we've seen amazingly fruitful conversations and demonstrations crossing these lines. And one thing I want to flag is maybe we can discuss how that meeting of seemingly different kinds of people, kinds of experts, might be a way to get around some of these tensions. So what I want to do is talk about the duality that I'm most familiar with, which is the duality between cognition on the one hand and sort of action or behavior on the other. And this roughly maps on to the distinction between mind and body, or between innovation, thinking, thoughtful activities on the one hand versus the sort of rote memorization and skill on the other hand, habitual performance. And before I go on, I should acknowledge that one of the reasons there's a tension that we've seen is that there exists in our societies, in our socio-political institutions, hierarchical relationships. And that is where some of these problems arise. Because what you find is certain, and this became clear in talking to Carol yesterday, she articulated, look, people have had a lower view of kind of traditional craftspeople. And one of the things she was trying to demonstrate is the amount of, in her words, cognition that goes on in designing and developing not only the weaving itself, but the technology behind it, and how cognitive an activity that is. So I guess I want to flag, what is cognition? And I'll give you my little spiel, but I think that's something we should talk about, because we've been using this word. It's part of the name of the conference. I think it's why I was invited. I'm certainly no weaver. What is cognition? And the traditional view puts it in that mind box. And so if you go to the philosophy department at Columbia, they have a beautiful Rodin Le Penseur sculpture right outside, which is this male figure, and it's not an accident that it's a man. And he is naked, by the way. He's not wearing any clothes, because we know that doesn't affect how we think. And he's just sitting there in contemplation. And that's the thinker. And I think this is the mental model a lot of people have when we think about cognition. And Dorothy mentioned earlier, even the traditional view in the science that I work in, cognitive science, has been that cognition is this internal, thoughtful, explicit, verbalizable process. And so I think that's where we find a key tension, because on the one hand, we can think about our ability to think, and this is one we value. This is one that happens to, I'm no expert on this stuff, but is gendered in our society, as you can see reflected in the sculpture and who made the sculpture. And I think it gets something fundamentally wrong. But I think it's revealing. So let me just talk briefly a couple minutes about sort of some of these new ways of thinking about the mind, the body, the relationships, cognition that Dorothy mentioned before, Ulinka's already brought up as discussion points. And one thing I'll do is just suggest, first of all, we can learn a lot about how people think by looking at the discussion points I just raised. And so what do I mean by that? We tend to think about the world in categories. And we tend to think about the world in these binary categories, at least very often. And it's very useful. It provides a useful framework for getting certain work done. So it's useful to contrast the explicit and the tacit. It's useful to contrast verbalizable knowledge versus non-verbalizable knowledge. It allows us to make progress in certain things. But the categories themselves are a product of our cognition. They're not part of necessarily the ontology of the world. And in my own work, what I try to do, and this is my work on everyday cognition, is to show scientifically that the everyday behaviors people engage in, these actions, actually shape our cognitive processing, this supposedly putatively internal, thoughtful stuff. And not only that, our supposedly internal stuff, we consistently offload into the environment. And then I'm going to make a connection to weaving, and then I'll be done. So let me just give you a couple examples of research in my lab. So one thing that came up yesterday in the talks by the psychologists and the cognitive neuroscientists, so Patricia and Daphne, was one of our cognitive abilities is the ability to mentally manipulate information. So mental transformations or simulation, internal simulation. So I can say, for example, all right, imagine yourself going out of the room and walking down the stairs of this building, and you have probably no problem doing that. We can even do problem solving this way, so I'll give you a little fun task. Imagine the letter J. All right, you got it? Now imagine the letter D. Now rotate in your mind the letter D so that the curved part is on top. And then put it on top of the J. And what common object do you have? An umbrella. Well, that was amazing, right? Because you just took my words and somehow built a mental picture, and that's a very metaphorical thing, and that's amazing. So I've studied this mental imagery ability, and what we find is that it is constrained by our everyday actions with objects in the world. So we think about it as this separation from the world, but it's actually constrained by it. So in one of my experiments, what we have are these 3D Tetris pieces. So just picture a Tetris piece, and they're in the real world. And there's a classic task called the mental rotation task, where you can basically measure how long it takes someone to rotate an image of an object in their mind's eye, like you just did with the letter D. You can time them. And what we did in our study was we had people physically rotate these objects, and some of them were easy to rotate. They were hooked up to these platforms, and some of them were more difficult to rotate because the platform was kind of filled with sand, and there was the device we built made it so that it was harder to rotate it. So they played around with these, and then we had them do the mental rotation task, and what you find is people are slower to mentally rotate objects that were harder to physically rotate. So their actual action in the world, their interaction with these objects, had a direct effect on their cognitive processing. Now, in other more recent work, I look at the sort of inverse of this process, where people use some aspect of the world to distribute or offload the burden of this internal processing to the external world. And most of you are doing it right now, and you're taking notes. So when you're taking notes, you're relieving the burden of your internal memory because now it's externally stored. It's very useful. And what we do in a fun study that my student just completed for her senior thesis was we had people study lists of words. So she'd give them a list of words. They have 30 seconds to learn it. It's a list of 10 words. And then they had to study a second list of words. Okay? So they have to study 2 lists of words and keep them in their mind separately. This is actually really hard. But after they studied the first list of words, they did one of 2 things. They either saved that list, they put it in a folder with their name on it, or they put it through a paper shredder. And what you find is that people remembered more words from the second list when they had saved the first list. Even though they had no longer had access to it. They weren't looking at it. They knew we only really cared about their learning of the second list. And we had each person do it both ways multiple times. And this is a finding. People have also found this kind of effect with storing it digitally on the computer. And so if you think about the implications of this kind of work, or what I think you find is that cognition is not so easy to define anymore, because it blurs with what we normally think about as actions, taking notes, moving them around, picking up objects. And so the duality of thinking about the cognition-action distinction, I think, is useful heuristically, but we have to remind ourselves that it's not necessarily part of the rigid ontology or the rigid structure of the world. And a final point that I want to make is, so we think in terms of categories. They often have these binary qualities that we've seen. They're very difficult to resolve because we tend to think in this way. I'm suggesting maybe we should discuss the specific resolutions. I mean, that's what Pamela set out for us in the beginning. But one thing I also want to point out is this idea of offloading technology. This is one of the things that the weavers have mentioned, that in the structure of these looms, even these very traditional kinds of looms, what you see is offloading some of the cognitive work. So I was amazed by the setup of the Laotian loom yesterday, where as Carol mentioned, it was programmed. They program it. And she used that metaphor from computing to talk about how the weaver is actually a programmer, and they designed the loom to store the patterns ahead of time, at least in some form, so that as they're weaving, they can actually make much more intricate and complex things in a faster amount of time, while maintaining the highest level of quality of hands craftsmanship. And I loved that she used this analogy or this metaphor that, look, the loom is like a computer because it's useful. This is the other thing I study, that we use metaphors and analogies to talk about and to think about, to structure our thinking about new and difficult domains of experience, because it leverages something we already know about. In this case, we know about computers and programs, to understand what for me was a device that seemed unfathomable as I looked at it. And that helped me understand it. Now, of course, on the flip side, Carol and Pamela and others have pointed out that, in fact, the digital computer owes its origins to the analogy that went in the other way, where Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace, I guess, looked at the Jacquard loom and said, aha, we can take that and turn that into what an analytical engine. And of course, the term computer itself actually first described humans, mostly women, who did mathematics by hand for the military and for early NASA to compute, how to send rockets at other people and into space. And that analogy, that term kind of became co-opted as a term for this digital computation. So we think in terms of categories, and the way we think abstractly very often is about mapping different ones of these categories onto one another, and those are shaped by our actual actions, our embodied activity in the world, which I think helps dissolve this one duality that we're faced with. So just a couple last sentences here. So I'd like us to discuss, how do we resolve all these dualities? How do we keep in mind things that I'm not an expert in, but that are very real and that came out today, which is the challenges due to the socio-political structures and economic structures that are currently in place. And I have no idea. I'd love to hear how to resolve some of those issues. And how do we encourage this kind of meeting and this kind of meeting of the minds, meeting of the bodies that we're experiencing here, that crosses disciplinary boundaries, that I think that may be one of the solutions for dealing with some of these tensions. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for raising those wonderful areas for discussion. I mean, certainly the resolutions of binaries, the changing the narrative to an optimistic narrative from what we were talking about at lunch as a very pessimistic narrative of the future of handcraft in the industrialized and system of capitalism. Okay, good. Could we have the first question, please?
Hi, thanks. Pressure of the first question. Is this?
I don't think that's
Yeah.
on. Try now. Try now.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah,
Yes.
there we go.
Okay, cool. Thanks. First, thank you all so much for this incredibly, mind-expanding and sort of broad-ranging journey. My question comes from something that we just heard about the heuristic, but I think it relates to some of the themes I've been hearing. As you mentioned, the heuristic approach is useful, or rather the binaries are useful for heuristics of actually accomplishing certain things, but that leads to a prior question, I think, of why are those heuristics useful, even when they don't match ontology? And this sort of, I wonder if this reflects, in a way, the question Uzrama pointed to about historiography, whereby a certain narrative of production and of value started to kind of be reified in how the economy was structured in India, so that traditional craft was devalued and lost because it was never explored. So I'm wondering, like, where are these reflections possible, and are they, sort of codified by actions that follow the narratives but actually become embodied and practiced?
Yeah. Oh, I'll respond. That's an amazing question. So let me take it in two parts, and I'll try to do it quickly, because hopefully someone else has something to say about it as well. So why are these sort of simplified binary categories useful if we don't think they match our maybe the actual structure of the world or the real complexities of human thought and action and society? Well, all representations are wrong. So any model, like even of the weather tomorrow, is wrong, but it can capture some amount of the variability that we want to explain. And so I think, for example, the division between cognition and action, I think it's limiting in some ways. It's not accurate, but it's useful because sometimes I'm talking to someone and it's clear they're not hearing what I'm saying. And it's useful to say, oh man, you were just thinking about something else. You're daydreaming. It captures something about what's going on. Similarly, as we've heard, even reflected in brain structures, a simplistic way of starting to understand it is to break it down into separable functions. I should say that, the brain is not a uniform structure, but a lot of the recent movements in neuroscience and theoretical neuroscience are trying to break down some of the sort of traditional, there's a language area, there's a this area, there's a that. It kind of blurs those lines and increases complexity. But the first models capture something. That means we know that if someone gets brain damage in their left hemisphere, they're probably gonna have a language deficit. So they can be useful while being wrong. But to your second point, this gets at that, which I think is the true insight, which is that our conceptual frameworks for how the world works can then, as you use the word reify, and I like that, can make real these categories. And I think I agree with you, the point about what happened in India. I had a similar thought as I was listening to the story. And I think that's exactly what we find. And what I would point out is maybe some of the solutions to some of this stuff exist in changing the narratives we have about certain things. Now, again, I'm biased, but I think it would be about what we mean by thinking and what we think the goals of education are. So is the goal of education to turn everyone who goes to college into a le penseur? Or should we, if we eroded the boundary between the thinker and the doer, the weaver, the maker, as a lot of Pamela's work is aimed at trying to do, I think, would we find different outcomes in people's conceptual frameworks? So, and I was talking to Roger about this at lunch, and then I'll stop rambling on because I know I have a tendency to do so. But we were talking about how, in the West, we value a liberal arts education. We want the bankers on Wall Street to have gotten not just a degree in economics, but we like them to have core classes in, I think, Western civilization here or world civilizations. And at my school, they have to take courses in social science and natural science and literature and English and even a wellness class. They've got to take yoga or Zumba or something. And what they don't have to do is learn a craft. Any kind of craft. If you're at a conservatory school, you do. And my school is known, Purchase is known for its conservatories, but I'm in the liberal arts and sciences school, and we don't have a requirement for them. So one thing I think that would be interesting is if core curricula started emphasizing these more embodied skills as courses. I wish I had to take a weaving class in college or something like that, where the emphasis is on maybe this other kind of cognition.
Can we have responses from the speakers? Does anybody want to respond? Yep, and then Claire.
I mean, just in response to this last comment, in sort of pre-college education, when these kinds of skills were taught in home economics courses, and we all know the history of what happened to home economics, but that these kinds of practical life skills, were drained out of the educational curriculum. But certainly by the 1970s, that process was pretty much complete. Particularly for those of us who are educators, and maybe even some of you in the room who are parts of schools of education, I think one of the challenges is how do we begin to move these kinds of skills, back into the everyday curriculum, not just weaving, but cooking and even quotidian activities like how to fix your own car. In the rush to train everybody to be a scholar or a quasi-scholar, we've lost the appreciation for these practical arts, and I think the sort of screaming need that we see in society as a whole, people watching YouTube videos, or going to maker spaces, or flocking to community colleges to learn woodworking, is an example that there's a social desire, as the capacity to self-actualize in a professional setting, disappears. People are looking for it in other spheres of their lives.
Claire's next, and then Roger.
This is more of a personal anecdote, but I've thought about it a lot during this conference. I was highly educated and ended up studying economics, or actually philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford. First week I'm there, I walk down this wonderful medieval street, and there's this incredible yarn store. I'd never knitted in my life, really. I'd sewn a lot. I walked in, and I started knitting. And now I see the link to what I do in my career. It took me 30 years to get there, but it's the same thing. And the embodied cognition that I never realized I had about knitting is what lets me do what I do every day. And I do think we've lost it, and I think we need to rebuild that. And just a little aside, I belong to a knitting guild in Slater Mill, Rhode Island, and we've been talking about this. Can we take knitting to the schools and teach them? And it's one of the things that we're thinking that we might be able to do.
Thank you. So I was just going to say that, I think there is a fundamental problem here in seeing, in thinking about specific skills as the only form of embodied knowledge, and that we have to learn knitting or jewelry or whatever in order to gain these embodied ways of knowing, because actually they are around us all the time, and it is how we are and who we are, as well as how we think, I think. And there's certainly in the UK, there's a very dangerous belief beginning to take hold that goes back to the hierarchies of knowledge and power we talked about over the last couple of days, that if you want to get a good job, you need to do science. And if you want to do science, then you can forget about art. And that these very unhelpful binary divisions are all over the place. Mm. And I think instead of, as well as doing what various people have talked about in terms of developing people's abilities in various forms of embodied knowledge, I think we should also value the embodied knowledge that we all have all the time. And I think one of the problems there is that so much of that embodied knowing is mediated through touch. And since there is no single localized touch organ like the eye or the ear, but it's all around us all the time, it's perilously easy to, and since there is no lexicon for communicating specifically about the things that are mediated through touch, it's perilously easy to ignore the effect of bodily connection with everything we do all the time, and to make these artificial distinctions and to try and tease out the cognitive from the embodied, which seems to me to be completely nonsensical.
That's really interesting and profound. I find myself thinking about Steve's last comment. And I want to kind of ask all of us, even though it might be a little bit too abstract or philosophical. And I take it, Stephen, your question really is, does resorting to binaries necessarily create hierarchies? And my undergraduate students and I have been talking about this in our seminar for the past 13 weeks or 12 weeks. And I've been talking about this issue with various friends who have visited essentially historians of science who know Chinese. And it seems that what I think, or in a way just to be provocative, is that there can be binaries, or there can be dualities, dichotomies, polarities, however we might call it, that are less conducive to producing these social and political or intellectual hierarchies or inequalities, if we somehow can have a mental capacity, linguistic capacity to keep on shuttling back and forth. And to have a way to recognize some kind of in-between position in the spectrum, wherever that might be. So perhaps, just to be provocative, maybe can we blame Aristotelian analytic logic? That really, want us to be structuralist and want us to be absolutely precise and clear every step along the way, that maybe is inhibiting part of this shuttling back and forth.
Anybody else?
Can I provide?
I think we should.
Okay.
If you can do it in one sentence.
Yeah, I just think there's a metaphor that supports what you just said, which is the warp and the weft. It's a binary that is complementary.
Good point.
Thank you so much all for speaking. Hearing about the current era, or even perhaps the future of the relationship between weaving as craft and technology as collaborative is very exciting to hear. But can any of you comment on considering the revival or reinterest in craft today as a response to hyper-commercialization, which may actually in fact be cyclical, and we can look back to periods of design reform or reactions against the degradation of quality in production commercially as part of this cyclical response within society, and if that is an indication of a particular cognitive practice or capability.
So you're referring to a current idea about cycles. Would anybody like to speak to that? Mari? No. Annapurna.
I'm not going to, I would like to think more about what happens to weavers, for example, when they have to deal with these cycles. And I think that what I see is that they're always generating what I would call a recruiting narrative. So they find a way to cast themselves into a solution to a problem that society is facing at that point. So it's not. So it's a narrative that allows you to act in a particular kind of way, and I think really that is the innovation that's what they're most innovative at, to make new meanings for their craft and more new relevance for themselves. Every time these kinds of cycles happen, because fashion, for example, is the most vicious cycle that they can get caught in. But this is how they face it.
I think Annapurna just kind of answered what I was going to say, but I was thinking about your statements about tension, And in all of the discussions, I've heard a lot of talk about the loom versus technology, but I just wanted to put the focus back on the fact that the loom is a device that holds the warp under tension. Without the tension, you can't weave. So all of the different dichotomies that we're talking about are really inherent in the weaving process, because it is all about one set of threads under tension, which is the warp, and one that's not under tension, that's the weft. And it's the weaver's choice how they're going to control those. So thank you, Annapurna, for putting the focus back on the weaver. It's the weaver who controls the technology, not the other way around, and it's the weaver who drives the technology. So even when we're going to look at like the kind of work Carol does, you're just talking about going back to handicraft to study the technology. So I just wanted to open up any of your ideas on that particular object, on focusing on what the weaver contributes to cognition, not the process, not the technology of weaving.
I just want to point out that the loom is the technology. We're talking, people are talking about the hand loom versus technology. It is a technology, it's just simpler, different.
Needle is a technology.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a point. I'm not feeling very clear about this, but it seems to me that watching the weavers at work over the last couple of days has been absolutely fascinating. But it's been quite clear to me that there is all sorts of stuff that the expert weaver experiences that a non-weaver watching that happening cannot experience, and that clearly these things cannot be expressed in words. They're not amenable to textual description, really. But is there a way we can think about developing some kind of language is the wrong word because it implies words, and that's what I'm trying to get away from. Perhaps lexicon might work as a word, but is there some way of developing a means of communicating about those things that are at the moment hidden from view? Even when you're watching somebody, you're not really understanding what it is that they're feeling, and you're not able to distinguish between what an expert is doing and what a novice is doing in terms of these embodied practices. And I'm just wondering whether this remarkable group of people from so many different perspectives, whether we could start thinking about how to develop a means of communicating about these things that have always defied articulation.
I'm going to take an easy way out and use the work of a scholar, Harry Collins again, who talks about interactional expertise. And it's the expertise of developing a way to communicate to an expert in something where you can't contribute to the knowledge of that group, but you know enough to be able to talk to them.
But that's about talking.
Yes, and so my point is that if it is embodied knowledge, I think to develop interactional expertise, you actually have to do it, and there's no other way.
Yeah, I think that the Philosophes who put together the encyclopedia also had that problem of how do you communicate, how do you actually form a really rational language of craft, and they did it through pictures, and the encyclopedia is, of course, full of pictures, full of images.
Thank you. We've spoken about various different ideas, embodied knowledge and embodied cognition. We've talked about the maker movement. We've talked about learning as far as age 7 and becoming a weaver, and then by age 12 becoming a master weaver. And we're here right now in an academic institution. And I'm kind of curious as to all the solutions that have really been put forward so far, except with just the mere mention of the maker movement, kind of deals with as far as within the institutions. A speaker just recently said that he wished that he'd had a compulsory course in some type of maker institution. And with the history of compulsory education and with anti-child labor laws, I'm kind of curious if someone would take an anti-institution position or an uninstitution position, meaning that you do not rely on the institutions, versus taking the weaving to the school, versus a way of going around institutions for solutions? Or how have institutions actually hindered the transmission of embodied knowledge through generations? I'm kind of curious if anybody has any insights on that or any theories that they would like to share.
How institutions have hindered the transmission, did you say? I'm sorry, I just blanked out there.
It could be two tracks as far as how have institutions hindered the transmission of embodied knowledge through generations, or what are some possible solutions as far as going forward that do not rely on institutions? Do they have any thoughts on that?
I'll take a stab at that, and then, because I'm sure that Ulinka actually has a lot to say about that also, which I think that was a very good point that Ulinka made, is that we often have the narrative of what comes out of really a domestic economy, you know, the traditional domestic economy before we moved into the commercial economy, and that domestic economy, hand skills were passed down from generation to generation within the family. So, you know, that's not obviously necessary to the learning of hand skills. One question is the embodied kind of teaching that Patricia pointed out so well necessary to hand skills, or can it be done in a more, what we think of, formal schooling way? And I would suggest, and I'll be very interested to see what the other speakers think, is that in fact there is no other way to teach a lot of these skills, is that it really does need another body next to you, in which the apprentice, let's call that person, needs to observe and copy and imitate in order to learn them. So, you know, institutions have sometimes fostered that kind of imitation. For example, our medical system, our system of training physicians and clinicians actually fosters that system through its residencies and internships and so on, to a certain extent, although it still, of course, values propositional knowledge and verbal and text-based knowledge also. So those are my thoughts. I mean, I think that we need to get over this idea of informal versus formal schooling. I mean, there's nothing more formal than, in many ways, than a traditional apprenticeship. And so those are some initial thoughts, but I'll ask Ulinka to speak.
Yes, so my question would be about which institutions have taught more successfully and why is that? And I would also say that, you know, our world, the academic world, is also about embodied skills, and they're just not taught that way, which is why we have a lot of illness, why we have a lot of back problems, because people don't know how to stand, because they don't know how to look after themselves. So, you know, we're not different. Yeah.
So alongside my apprenticeship, I also did a college course, because there was kind of a concern that doing an apprenticeship wasn't enough, and I needed some sort of formal qualification when I finished. There were major limitations in learning what I do in a college course. It just couldn't really be done, actually. We didn't get to repeat things in the way that you need to. We couldn't see things because there was 30 people in a class. I found to learn I needed to be right next to the person, seeing exactly what they're doing and trying to copy what they're doing. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, another example strikes me. I've been doing quite a lot of work recently with close-up magicians who do stuff, you know, you'll do very dexterous stuff. And, well, the one I've been talking to said that these days magicians, they don't learn like he did, which was doing it in front of a mirror in his bedroom for ages and ages. They learn from YouTube videos. And they are extraordinarily good at doing what they see on video, on YouTube videos. And the level of dexterity has never been higher, but the level of performance has never been worse, because people are learning how to do things in terms of what they do with their fingers and their hands, but they are not learning how to perform. They're not learning how to understand how to read an audience. They haven't got somebody with them guiding them through the process. And although they become very good at one aspect of the work, they are completely unable to perform at an expert level in the wider context of actually what it's all about, which is performing magic in small groups. And I just thought that was an interesting parallel to some of the things we've been discussing.
Yeah, let me raise the question then. Oh, sorry, did you want to speak to that, Claire? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's very good points about learning from YouTube, because that's something that we see in lots of parts of crafts. But I just want to comment on the academic environment for teaching these things, because in my business, now that we have this machine from Japan, we now need more people who've got those skills. And North Carolina State University is probably the best college of textiles in the world. And we work with them a lot, so they have a lot of Shima equipment that Shima gave them because they as a company are trying to get these skills embedded into the college. And but they have turned out very few people who are skilled in it, because the university, the curriculum, has not been allowed to actually have a course just focused on how to think about the technology and use it. And another gentleman, I mentioned one from the Nottingham lace industry, there's a professor at NCSU who was finally, he came out of the knitting industry in Nottingham, and he finally told me just this week that he's going to run a short course for anybody in the public, so anybody who's interested can contact me in August, a week-long course, just to get the interest out, and then he's going to finally get a formal course with credit for his students. And he said, next year I can give you students who will be qualified, but not this year. So it is happening, but he had to fight for 5 years because it wasn't theoretical or academic enough to have this course.
It probably didn't have a written product. I mean, that's another problem. You know, within the university curriculum, an object is probably not good enough as a final project, although some of that is changing.
But even if we examine the primary school and middle school, kids stop doing crafts at school probably when they are in 3rd grade, 4th grade, and then they are involved in art, and then they stop doing art. So there is this duality of arts and craft. And so they need craft when they are really young, because they have to develop their brain. And I don't know why, at a certain point, their brain cannot keep growing, continuing using crafts.
Part of it, I think, is the infantilization of craft, a kind of byproduct of Montessori training and so on. I mean, an unexpected byproduct, presumably. Roger, sorry. Yeah.
About science. Got a lot of colleagues at the university where I work who do biomedical science, and several of them have said to me that the students who are now coming to do science at that university have gone through their secondary school education in science without doing any, or hardly any. So they go through all their time without ever really doing experiments, without boiling things up and using test tubes and doing things with Bunsen burners and moving things from one container to another container, or whatever it is that scientists do. But whatever it is that they need to do, they can't do it. And so by the time they get to university, there is this huge gap of things that, until very recently, rather like the Weavers, I suppose, people you could take for granted. And I had thought that this was something that people were only sort of experiencing at PhD level, where people didn't have the higher level skills. But it seems to me that it is as much a problem in the world of science as it is in any other of the areas of expert practice that we've been talking about.
I think I'm learning more than I can contribute, but as a doctor, when patients start losing their memory, losing their cognition, what we found is when you ask them to do things, their cognition is getting better. And I, as I mentioned in my response yesterday, I discover now, we tell them they feel better, and they are more interactive, and they communicate better. But the advice that we always give them is get them to do things. So the first question we ask them is what were their hobbies? And then they say, I say give them a painting book, but I agree with you, it's been infantilized. So I tell them retain their dignity and still get them to paint. So we've really gone back so many years in order to get to do things that will actually make them feel better. We are needing to justify and shroud it with some kind of, this is what they need. And I think now it actually does improve their cognition. And when I was discussing with Annapurna about, what will a neurologist say, and we were talking about from cognition to doing, and she said, no, it's about from doing to cognition. So I'm beginning to wonder if, and now I see that the duality is needing to be resolved. I'm not saying that we build cognition by doing, but they definitely are coming closer. And again, I was talking to Patricia, and she said, in America we advise these things as therapy. Art is therapy. Puppetry is therapy. And I know for sure that anything that helps a diseased brain will probably help prevent a brain from getting diseased. So I really don't see why we just need to do it all our lives, and then it probably will help.
Thank you. I want to raise a quick observation which seems relevant here. And Ulinka mentioned what makes an expert. And part of what makes an expert is a cultural field or a community that defines that expertise. And of course, in what I know, European craft associations or guilds, it was basically a program, what we could call it, of certification of a sort, of creating a masterpiece, going through a series of, we all know these certifications. So in some places, Japan, for example, there is a position which is called a national treasure, intangible national treasure or intangible heritage. And that has led to a valorization of crafts. So some of the issues of the educational system is also that there is no longer in most places any sort of certification or formal course by which, or formal course of work and study and achievement that can put that into place. And so I'm just wondering, from the people who are working on that, whether on weavers, whether that seems like it would be a useful thing or a non-useful thing.
Yeah, I think ownership of knowledge is something that has become quite difficult, because especially if knowledge is tacit, how do you measure it? How do you evaluate it? And how do you give people credit for having it? It's one thing for people to make claims by themselves, but and I think what has happened with handloom weavers definitely is that they've gone into the market. So the only validation they have is the price that they get paid. So very often when they don't get the price, they're not just financially worse off, but their self-esteem and sense of place in the world goes down. And that, I'm sure, is not true only for craftspeople, it's true for a lot of people. So the idea that we need to find some way of evaluating and measuring these things is important. But to answer this question of how it can go wrong, I would actually like to talk about being a social worker. Now, one of the attributes of being a social worker is that you care. But social work, especially if you're doing something like working with handloom weaving and you've done it for 15 years, also becomes an expertise. But if these things are perceived to be something which are natural attributes, you're just a caring person, then there are only two possible outcomes that can happen. You can hide it, that you are not a very caring person. You can perform the care and actually be an opportunistic bitch. Or you can burn out. I mean, those are really the only two options. So I completely agree with you that we need to find ways of evaluation and that we don't have them. But these are the kinds of attributes that are particularly difficult to measure and to attribute.
Right, because we don't have a way of talking about those craft experiential knowledge. In general, it gets naturalized, in fact, as emotions are often naturalized also. Okay, let's go to our next question. You have been very patient. Thank you.
Is this on? Okay. It's actually not a question, it's a comment. I actually I'm a long-time textile conservator at a local institution, which I don't really want to name, but you've been seeing it on the paper all this time. And it's something very interesting that I have noticed is that over the beginning in 1979 with a degree in history of art and architecture and a background using my hands and a cultural background where textiles were valued and also passed down, along with stories, etc. The disconnect between the objects in the cases and the scholarship that was, the scholarships around those objects. And even with textiles, even people who really are wonderful scholars, but sometimes, you would read what they wrote and you'd think, I wonder if they actually looked at this thing, because it's actually this way, or it's actually embroidery. And one of the most amazing things, if you just have to live long enough, is to have come into this new age of these incredible images and this rapid fire advances in not only the capturing of images, but in the sharing of images. And I think that between that and the possibility, between being able to capture these images and being able to share them worldwide, that's, I think, a great equalizer. It's a way of sharing knowledge, because one of the first things that I noticed when I began to work with these images, I had been asked to write a chapter for an exhibition on English embroidery, unheard of for a conservator to have a chapter in the text of the book. And I was so paralyzed because I had never published before, Yale University Press, the whole thing, the nightmare. What would my kids think? And I started to, I knew what they would think. Anyway, I started to take images, and after procrastinating till the last moment, and then I began to look up these images, and I began to write to the images describing things that I was seeing. And I thought, this isn't gonna wash, because it's just what I'm seeing. And it actually turned out to be quite successful and very well received, both by specialists and non-specialists. I think we're just beginning to understand what visual thinking is, and that it is actually thinking, and that it's compounded by the fact that we can share things invisibly. You can, so communities in my field, the reenactors, the costume people, the crafts people, the scholars, the museum, the conservators, they can all be in the same group and never know it, because it's on Pinterest or Facebook. And for all of the bad aspects about that, for me, it's been a huge liberation, not only of the objects that I work with, but beginning and especially with libraries. So anyway, that's just my observation.
Thank you so much, because that really resonates with one of the things that I have found about object-based research projects and object-based conferences. So this is an example of an object and doing-based conference, because we have the objects. You'll be able to look at them more closely. And we had the makers actually interacting with us. It would have been even more ideal if we had the, everybody sitting on the ground at their own backstrap loom and actually conducting the workshop in that way, or the conference in that way. It would be very interesting to see how we would turn over hierarchies. But I think that, I think your point about these communities, which used to be so really such strong hierarchies, such as between art, conservators and art curators in museums, that they are being broken down by the, oh, well, you're looking skeptical, but, well, maybe they will be broken down by the kind of work around the object, around the materials. And that is, of course, facilitated also by the fact that there are a lot of videos, as everyone has said, on YouTube.
And I just wanted to add one thing, which is that these images can now bring us so close in, and eventually, if you know, anybody can be Darwin if you're getting close enough. All of a sudden, you get to a point where you think, oh, of course this reflects. So of course this is incredibly expensive. You can see it in the material itself. Of course these two things were not made by the same person, in the same place, in the same century. At some point, the object is the object. You get in that close, and as these different lenses for magnification have become more accessible, and as the iPhone and iPad have become such phenomenal tools that you can zoom in on something, it is interesting to me how much other information you can convey in an image. The reflection of something, the color, things that are responses, physical responses that you have when you see something or do something, and but we can do that now a little bit, and it's just the beginning, and it's actually a very exciting time.
Yeah, that fits into my optimistic narrative, and your work with the digital microscope has totally transformed the way I do textile research. So I would not go anywhere near a textile now without my digital microscope, which is attached to the laptop, and it adds visual acuity. And as you say, on the one hand, there's sharing of images, but we need to reinforce that they two go hand in hand. So we need to then still look at the objects. And so many people, for instance, Dagmar Schäfer at the Max Planck Institute, you are exploring new ways of publishing that will be the outcome of these explorations.
And I think that the generation coming in are developing much more visual acuity than we ever did, partly because of, any 12-year-old with an Instagram feed is putting up these incredible images and compositions, not all the same, not every, but they are looking and they are communicating with an image, and they're looking for that place in that in the picture that is going to pack a punch or
make their
communicate.
Claim.
Yeah.
Contribute to their argument. Yeah. Lan. I think let's go to the next question.
Hi, thanks. I'm still thinking through this a little bit. Something that Ulinka and Annapurna mentioned. So Ulinka brought up the idea of kind of considering multiple modernities, and Annapurna this using weaving and textiles as a way of imagining alternative futures. And I've been wondering whether or not multiple modernities or alternative futures, whether or not these ideas reinforce dichotomies. Maybe the binary we can shuttle between these binaries, but then I've been struggling with this in my own work on integrative medicine and Chinese medicine and medical theory, because when I say Chinese medicine, I use it as a kind of activist category. It doesn't mean it's a nationalistic product. When I talk about Chinese medicine, I also talk about Taoist medicine and Buddhist medicine. And in a US context, alternative has been politicized in a different way, where the National Health Institute has abandoned the language of alternative, and their center is now called complementary integrative. And even in the clinic, a lot of health referrals are really terrified of patients who want alternatives. But at the same time, I wonder if these alternative modernities, I wonder what they're really useful in terms of their nationalistic products. Again, going back to Chinese medicine as an example, people study Tibetan medicine, and I wonder if, in dealing with these dichotomies, if we need to engage with nationalistic products from the West, in a sense that when we talk about Western technologies, can we locate them nationally? Would that be a more symmetric discussion? And maybe this is kind of a push against Cold War area studies, where we look at local connections rather than national. So I'm just wondering what you think about kind of symmetries and productively engaging with the idea of multiple and alternative without and producing useful dichotomies, maybe, and useful multiplicities.
I stay at the microphone because I think we'll need clarification about whether you mean that looking at national, identifying it by national narratives is useful or not useful?
This is more of a question also for the activists, because it is useful. It's a pragmatic tool, but then intellectually it also reinforces it. It's maybe kind of a stand-in, and it's and maybe can incite some policy change, but it requires some more thought, because I have a huge problem with it, but I still use it to communicate.
Good.
No, I think you should go first.
No, I see what you mean. I mean, we did see that in the morning the Indian lot tend to talk about the past and tradition, and in the Western lot tend to talk about modernity and the future. So, I mean, it didn't come from nowhere, that thought. We performed it. I'm actually saying that my weavers are more modern than the West. I'm saying they're more sustainable. When I say my, they're not mine. But the weavers that I work with or I'm studying are actually can fit very well into modernity. But they are stuck in an imaginary that puts them in tradition. So I am trying to see how we can operationalize those categories so in a way that's productive, so that people don't get left out, so that we keep the good. But I'm always aware that then you can get appropriated, and these discourses can get, may not be generative in the long term. So you can make a strategic alliance with a discourse, with an identity, but it has to make sense for the people who you are attributing it to. So for me, it's a very simple thing. I keep going back to the question of, would this make sense for the weaver, for him? When he talks about it, is it empowering at this moment for him or her? And that's for me a very good place to start with addressing that question, because otherwise it becomes too broad to talk about. Ulinka?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. There's lots we can say about that. I think for me, multiple modernities is helpful because it creates allowances, affordances, and I think it's very important not to talk in terms of strictures. So the discussion earlier about, should we rule out high fashion? I think that's a dead end. It's hugely creative, imaginative. Industry that has certain problems, but to say that shouldn't exist it's a particular pathway, just as Rama's model is a particular pathway that will work primarily for local ecologies and local markets, it seems. And I think we're at a moment where we should then explore these different pathways. Yeah.
I guess we decided, though, I think, that we wouldn't rule out, in our ideal world, high fashion, but rather mass fashion and fast fashion. And so the question, which I think we have to confront when we're talking about these things, is capitalism, and that is, that may in fact be that's a part of a multiple modernity, but it may in fact be a entirely consuming one. And so I guess that would be a question which I'm sure that Mari has something to say too.
Well, just very quickly, because time is getting late. I think we need to be careful in saying that you know, the sort of wealthy populations that consume couture fashion, you know, they're entitled to novelty and change, and those folks that are buying $5 T-shirts at H&M, you know, well, that's the root of the problem, and that we've got to stamp that out. I think the challenge becomes, how do we express the artfulness and the artistry associated with fashion in ways that don't continue to ramp up continuously the flow of resources, and perhaps drawing on some of the observations from the earlier panel this afternoon, is you know, is how do we create opportunities by embedding technology in fashion and in clothing that creates possibilities for continuous upgrading and sort of the renewal of the same physical resource in ways that don't require continual discarding and repurchasing.
I have too much to say, so let me just say that addressing Lan's original question about multiple modernities or alternative futures, I just want to make a comment as a historian that the world outside the West experienced a kind of mimetic modernity to the extent that colonialism was very powerful in exporting a certain model about development, about bodies, about desires. The rest of the world are still trying to have some of those things. And it's really hard to say, well, we have our flash toilets, so the Chinese are not entitled to have the flash toilets because it's really, really not so environmentally friendly. So I think that this is the ultimate conundrum that your question opens up. But since I have the mic and I have Kat waiting in the line, can I just say something that is totally unrelated to your question, but as you were thinking also this morning, I would just want to share my response that we have been talking a lot about the body, and we've been trying to conjure up a fully organic mind, body, head, hand, restitched and rebalanced, completely integrated kind of entity. But I think that in the process, maybe with the exception of Savannah, maybe we haven't really given culture and history their due in making different kinds of bodies, to the extent that if we grow up with rice and beans, the bodies that we're talking about are very, very different from the bodies in a different part of the world. So materiality really counts in this way, and I would really like to just think a lot more about alternative bodies, actually. Maybe alternative bodies that don't really exist in this room.
Very, very interesting. Okay, let's hold that question. And we have two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
So I asked this question at the talk on Tuesday, and I didn't really feel like it was answered, so I'm going to ask it again. But I'm really interested and excited about how we can break down, how we can break down national boundaries, especially through craft. So all different kinds of handwork, as we've discussed, is something that happens in so many different cultures. So are there examples of Indian handloom weavers working with Laotian handloom weavers, or any number of other examples? Maybe one way to encourage people to do handloom work is by creating some kind of more access for different kinds of weavers and craftspeople to talk and meet and share ideas and maybe even share, I don't know, different kinds of natural dyes, etc. I'm wondering if there are examples of that or if there are people working on that.
Maury, did you have your hand up? No.
There's the Santa Fe Folk Festival, where all the weavers in the world meet every year. Santa Fe Folk Festival.
This was sort of just random, but just 2 weeks ago I was in Ireland on vacation, and as is my wont, I went to see as many textile places as possible, and went to a place called Studio Donegal in Kilcar, tiny little village in Donegal. Turned out they're not mechanized like Lonely Planet said they were. They were hand looming. And there was a woman from southern Italy there who'd come all the way to southern Donegal to find out more about what they were doing, so that because they're trying to restart hand looming in Italy, in southern Italy. So I think these things are somewhat organic, but there's just a little example of how it can happen.
Yeah, actually, Carol just came in. Can you talk quickly about the Loin Loom Festival, which you just came from? Yeah.
Yes, I'd love to. A group of independent loin loom weavers, which loin loom abstract body tension, have had, I think it's the second annual festival. It's in Nagaland. It coincides with the Hornbill, if you're familiar with the Hornbill Festival. The minority ethnic groups of the Northeast have a festival every year. I think it's the first week of December. And I can send and share all that information with you, and they would love to have more visitors, international visitors.
And we were just talking about international groups of weavers getting together. So who was there at the Loin Loom Festival?
This year they had weavers from Thailand, Laos, and there was another, she wasn't a weaver, but I would call her a textile aficionado from Canada, who had been in the Foreign Service and knows Southeast Asian textiles well. This year, I'm working with a group in Ethiopia, and that group will be attending, and we'd like them also to visit other workshops in India, and they're planning to attend as well.
Thank you. Next question, last question.
Well, I wasn't here yesterday, so I don't know if this might have come up, but one binary I haven't noticed today, which I was totally familiar with when I was first exposed to weaving in the 1960s and 1970s, and that was the dichotomy between art and craft. And weaving became, during that period, weaving became a strong academic discipline, and then it kind of fizzed out as the looms were taken down and replaced by computers. I think one problem at that time that prevented weaving from being able to grow further as an academic discipline was that there was no language for discussing it. And critics would come to see it, and one critic in particular that I know was a leading art critic went to see an exhibit at the encouragement of the curator, and this was at the Museum of Modern Art. He went to see the work, and she said, well, what did you think of it? And he said, it's fabulous. And she said, well, are you going to write about it? And he said, I wouldn't know what to say. So I am truly excited that weaving is reemerging with a language developing that can discuss it and acknowledge the many, many levels of importance that it has for human life.
Thank you. That's probably... What a wonderful place to end the discussion part of the day, I think. So thank you very much.